On the afternoon of 17 November 1939, an S unit was moving through Prague from the Ruzin district. "We're going to England," shouted the soldiers. "It's not far from Prague to England. There ahead is the canal, that beautiful creation of nature." The uniforms of the soldiers were not yet wrinkled. The dull faces of the recruits were inexpressive. It would not be long before they were in their native element. Fear and loathing were evoked by this black armada of conquerors. I looked at them, helpless and unarmed, and my hands involuntarily clenched into fists. I longed for open combat with the enemy. Christmas was approaching, and with it my departure for Belka. I don't think I have ever had a sadder Christmas in my life, and yet we all love and look forward to this joyous holiday. At times I felt fear at the thought of the future. When we decided to leave, our flat felt empty, cold, and uncomfortable, as if no one had lived here for a long time. I had a lump in my throat when I looked at the Christmas tree we had lit, but as soon as Františka smiled, I felt warm. The only thing that brightened up this dreary Christmas was our presents for the children. Milan shone with happiness when he saw the new toy car, which had 4 speeds and reverse. The baby went to bed with his new toy. Fred got real felted Wallachian boots. God, he was so excited about them. "Hey, you conspirators, what are you up to?" More than once he asked us in a stern voice, looking at us intently, as if trying to see what my friends and I were gossiping about. Fred didn't understand much, of course, and I didn't want to bring him up to speed. Children, if anyone asks them anything, should only say what they know, that is, tell the truth. Immediately after Christmas night, after we had distributed the presents, I left for Velká nad Veliká. It was snowing waist-deep in Prague. The public transport was practically inoperative, and I had a very difficult time getting to the railway station. I took with me a painting by Maestro Mina. It served as my password and opened the doors of Dr. P. Zenika's office in Wilka. Through him, I met my teacher, František Jagosis. He said that he could send me to Slovakia immediately, but as far as my family was concerned, he did not give any guarantees. The teacher advised me to wait a little long. It was very cold in Velk, 30 degrees below zero, and there was more than a metre of snow. But we couldn't waste time. Further events confirmed that I had not been in a hurry in vain. After my return to Prague, the time passed at a furious pace. Days were followed by nights, and it seemed as if nothing had happened. But then Irot was arrested, then Hadžikic disappeared. One day a mysterious visitor dropped by. Every hour, every minute was dangerous. At night we woke up every now and then in alarm. In the silence of the night I thought with horror about tomorrow. On the morning of 5 January 1940, I decided that we could not wait any longer. At about 12 o'clock in the afternoon, I informed the children that the snow was fine, the weather was perfect, so tomorrow morning we would go skiing in the mountains. There was no end to their excitement. They even forgot that we did not have skis. Farewell to friends was exciting and touching. At 2 o'clock in the morning they started to leave, and at 5 in the morning I woke up the kids who were sleeping sweetly. I walked round our flat for the last time. Cold, poorly heated rooms. Every little thing, every trinket was familiar and dear. Carpets, crockery, paintings. All this would now belong to who knows who. It was bitter to realize this. The Christmas tree stood lonely by the window, a symbol of our recent family happiness, peace and quiet in this house. We used to leave it in its place, let it serve as a living reproach to those who would come to our house with bad intentions. Františka tied the beds, tied our bedroom and the nursery. I helped her diligently, thinking about what would happen to our house, who would sleep in our beds tomorrow, which had warmed us for so many years. How good it had been for us here. After breakfast I was once again afraid. Run away from here. I couldn't eat a bite. Taking a suitcase with warm things for the children, we rushed to the taxi. A 6-seater Tatra was already waiting for us on the street. One last look at the house and our windows. As we headed for the car, I felt as if someone nodded to me through the window. As the car started and the children's heads almost touched ours, I thought again of their bitter fate. Was something ahead of them? On the bridge I threw the flat keys into the Vltava. I could have thrown them into the canal, but I chose the Vltava. I don't know why. They fell on the black water, breaking the invisible thread that bound me and my family to the past. It was a steep turn in our destiny. Today now something was irrevocably gone from us. A new page of our lives was opening. The first step had been taken. What will be the second? Welka nad Wilicka. There were still a few minutes before the train left for Brno. I couldn't stand it any longer and asked my wife, "Listen, Francisca, should we go back? After all, there is still time." She replied briefly, "No." She answered without hesitation, firmly. I liked the way she said it, and her determination was immediately transferred to me. As the train picked up speed, the station buildings came into view, and gradually the last doubts left me. If only I knew what we were all going to experience in the future. But that was not to be. I sat at the window and watched the last houses of Zizkov disappearing one by one into the misty distance. The kids were having fun. Why shouldn't the kids? After all, they were going to the mountains. Francisca had cut the appetizingly smelling wieners and was now looking for buns to make sandwiches. Aren't they starting all this early? I thought. I didn't care, though. On the way, as if by mutual silence, my wife and I hardly spoke at all. In Brno, we managed to get on the train to Veliki nad Velika quite quickly. No one met us, nor could they. We looked around. The Veliki railway station was nestled in the mountains, high above the village, and from here we had a magnificent view of the surrounding countryside. It was a beautiful winter day, and everything around us seemed so peaceful and calm, almost idyllic. Evening twilight was slowly descending from the mountains. Velka was drowning in snow. Even the simple hedges of the village were coloured with fanciful snowcaps. It had been a long time since I had seen such beauty. The white snow sparkled with purity and shone blue. I breathed easily and freely. Smoke flowed from the chimneys of the houses peacefully nestled in the mountain valley. It was time to feed the cattle. At that moment I even forgot about Jagosha, to whom we were going and who was to take care of our fate. In order not to be too conspicuous, we went through the village in two groups. Francisca with Fred, me with Milan. In the centre of the village we came face to face with German policemen, who looked at us with bewilderment and distrust. I became cold with terror, and, taking Milan by the hand, headed resolutely towards the frozen river. Feeling the suspicious glances of the Germans behind me, I began to skate on the ice, imitating in every possible way the unrestrained merriment in which Milan joined in quite sincerely. The policemen must have believed us, for after stomping about, they finally left. When they were out of sight, I stopped to catch my breath. At the last house on the road to the farm Jawornik, my heart beat fast, for it was the house where we hoped to find shelter. The teacher was literally stunned when he saw us all together. "I wrote to Mina that you should delay your arrival," he said grudgingly. "It's 30 degrees below freezing, with snow up to my waist and 20 people in the house." It was terrible, murderous news of which we had known nothing before. And as it turned out later, we didn't know. Go back to Prague. What if the Gestapo had already got wind of it? What if there's an ambush in our flat? Ludmila, the teacher's wife, came in. When she saw the frozen Milan, who was watching our conversation fearfully, her eyes warmed. She stroked the boy's crimson-red cheek and said conciliatingly to her husband, "All right, Franta, it will all work out somehow." Jagosh was clearly annoyed by our appearance, and I did not judge him. After some thought, he spoke up. "I have never had such a thing before." It was a refusal, or almost a refusal, but there was a conciliatory note in his voice. Later, the teacher confessed to us that at first he was afraid. Yes, he was taking refugees across the border, but they were adults, and when he saw the children and imagined for a second what might happen to them, his heart sank. So those first few minutes are behind us, I think. At any rate, we crossed the threshold of the house. The situation was indeed bleak. The Gestapo and numerous patrols with dogs were prowling around, which Jagos's men were trying to poison, but so far without much success. 3 days ago, the Nazis had beaten to a pulp a cross-dressing student who had tried to cross the border. Yes, the risk was great. We were well aware of that. Sensing our condition, the Jagoshovs tried their best to cheer us up, but they did not succeed very well. I sat and thought about what would happen next. Returning to Prague seemed to me now more dangerous than waiting here in Velk, almost at the very goal, where it was most convenient to cross into Slovak territory. We gladly availed ourselves of the hospitality of the Jagosovs and stayed. Our Milan immediately won the sympathy of Jagosh's children. Milan and 10-year-old Verkay, as well as the dog named Kashtan, who never left his side, obeying all his commands. Fred remained serious, even too serious for his age. But where were the people who, according to Jagosh, filled his house? Outwardly, everything seemed quite calm. It was quiet all round. I did not notice anything that could suggest to the Nazis what dangerous people were in the house of the village teacher. Suddenly I heard someone's carefree laughter, which seemed familiar to me. I immediately remembered. On the 25th of December, my first visit to Wilka, I had met a guy in a beer hall who had exactly the same unforgettable devilish laugh. Now he introduced himself to me. František Mašalek, pilot, lieutenant colonel. Yet at the beer hall, he was the leader at the last table. As soon as I appeared in the hall with the ill-fated painting under my arm, everyone immediately turned to me and froze. And a second later, Mahalek's devilish laugh was heard. What was he laughing at? What had made him laugh so hard? The painting? The sight of me? I don't know, but I felt uneasy at that moment. I was afraid of being exposed. Was he friend or foe? For a long time Mahalek made jokes about me, laughed, fooled around, and I kept silent and waited to see how it would end. Now he explained to me the reason for his behavior at that time. "Look, Franta," he said to Yagosh, alluding to a picture wrapped in a cloth. "Another lover of pets. Strange thing is, I was sure that I looked quite disguised and inconspicuous." The painting was a password, a conventional sign by which Yagosh identified his man. Mahalek turned out to be an easy-going man. He addressed my wife straight away, calling her auntie, and did not change this habit until his last days. There was something in his behavior that won people over, and they forgave Mahalek a lot. The next day Yagosh said that they would organize a fox hunt. The hunt was a cover, a kind of screen, using which Franta Mahalek and other people hiding at Jagos's place intended to cross the Slovak border unnoticed. I was not invited, and Mahalek surprised me greatly when he whispered, suggesting that I should go with them alone, as he put it, to give a dragonfly together. I think I was so dumbfounded at the ridiculousness of his invitation that he faded away and never came back to it. Early in the morning, Mahalek and Jagos began to persuade me to take part in the hunt. "It's the best time for the transition," they said with one voice. "What about my family?" I asked. "The family will wait until the weather improves," they answered. "And in the meantime, what will I do?" I asked. "Sit in Miawa and wait for your family to move there. And if something happens to them?" They were silent. There was something strange about this conversation, something unspoken. These men had promised to help me across the border, and the only thing they had to do was to fulfill their promise. When I told Františka about everything, she clung to me fearfully, and for some reason spoke in a whisper. "Don't believe them, please don't believe them. We must only go together." She was desperate. "You know, friends," I said a little later to Jagos and Mahalek, "our idea probably won't work out. However, try to talk to Františka yourself. I think they understood everything and didn't persuade me anymore." Fear again. Fear of not being able to get out of here with my family. Fear that something would separate us. And so the day passed in such a bleak and dreary way. Then we heard laughter. A Milan and Fred, happy and flushed from the frost, came back from sledging. How pleasant it was to hear the children's laughter. In the evening, lying in the huge double bed that the Jagotsos had kindly given us, Františka and I hardly spoke at all. We stared silently into the darkness of the night, mentally returning to the same question. "What will happen to us?" sighed my wife. She said nothing more. It was an unnecessary question. No one could give an answer to it. Františka was still awake, silent, but awake. Then we fell asleep. But what kind of sleep was it? Anxious thoughts kept us awake. Here at Yagosh's, we felt relatively safe. And what would happen later when we parted from these people? 8 January 1940, the third day of our stay in Wilka, was approaching sunset, and we were still sitting where we were. The inactivity was terribly depressing. I turned to the teacher to find out the situation. Frantic, distressed František told me that the approaches to Mijava were guarded by patrols of the Glinka Guard, and that the same thing was probably happening all along the border between Moravia and Slovakia. Jagos said that until he had accurate information, he would not disrupt us in vain. At first I thought our whole scheme had failed, but Jagos reassured me by telling me that usually such intensified border patrols did not last long. He advised me to be patient and wait. I could see that the teacher was sincerely trying to help us, and as if to confirm this, Jagos said, "Let's try to cross together." In the evening we learnt that Frante Mahalika and his group had managed to cross the border safely. On the way they even managed to shoot a fox. What a rascal! Jagis grumbled good-naturedly, and I was again reminded of Mahalik's booming laughter. These days I often thought of my old and sick father, who did not live in Prague. I must have upset him by our deed, depriving him of the joy of seeing his beloved grandchildren. He was not privy to my plans. I should have told my father the truth, of course, but I did not feel ready to do so. He seemed to have guessed a great deal. Wasn't it the foreboding of his near separation that had made him even more hunched lately? On the 9th of January, there was no new news about the situation on the border. I could not wait any longer. It was becoming dangerous for all of you, especially for the children. An inexplicable fear was tearing my soul. Something had to be done, and immediately. After lunch, there was a commotion. Jagos came and told me that we would be travelling early in the morning the other day. He discussed everything with the locals, and together they decided that we would cross the border of the protectorate in the guise of woodcutters, and the peasants would take our belongings and clothes to the mountaineers on the Slovak side. It was an idea, clear and simple. It was as if it breathed new life into us. We regained our self-confidence. We were eager for decisive action. It was not advisable to go out, so we hung around our rooms and talked non-stop. We couldn't sit still anymore. We were constantly worried about Melee. The thermometer outside showed 25 degrees Celsius. The teacher's message about the upcoming transition seemed to disperse all the cold around, and in the afternoon we still sent the children outside to get them used to the cold. The liaison returned on the 10th of January. The border was still guarded by reinforced troops to close off Western Slovakia from the influx of Czech refugees. These unfortunate people, the contact told me, wander near the border without money or shelter, causing much trouble for the authorities and the local population. A stone fell from my heart. There seemed to be no smell of Gestapovs there. True German and Slovak gendarmes were often visiting the mountaineers, and our plans to hide in the forest lodge were doubtful. Now everything was decided by time, but Jagos was in no hurry. In case of failure of the first option, he planned the second one. Like many sensible people, the teacher did not boast, did not exalt his own person, and even in the most critical moments could soberly assess the situation, especially now when human lives were at stake. Having carefully weighed all the pros and cons, Jagos finally set a date, Friday, 12 January. The route he chose for us was more difficult than usual, but it guaranteed relative safety. We had to make a big detour to bypass the German customs, and then, if we were lucky, we hoped to slip unnoticed into the virgin forest, which stretched for many kilometres. All day long, it was 30-degree frost. We jokingly called it a faint thaw. We were most worried about Milan. I was not afraid for Fred. He had Valish boots and a warm coat. In my heart, I hoped very much for human kindness, and I was not mistaken. As soon as it got dark, the peasants brought us shoes and warm clothes. The changing of clothes caused a cheerfulness. The boots were big and old. The fur hat covered Fred half his face, and only Frantiska's clothes were more or less suitable, tied crosswise with a woolen shawl. She looked like a true native of the neighbourhood. In the evening, a lieutenant, a pilot, and a lieutenant of railway troops appeared. Then came the rest of the refugees. It was time to leave. On the eve of leaving, on the 11th of January, we were resting and mentally preparing ourselves for the meeting with the unknown. To tell the truth, I was no longer afraid. All I wanted was to be on the other side of the mountains as soon as possible. We spent the remaining time with the Jagosovs. We felt at ease with these cordial people who sheltered us. Milan Jagos and his funny little sister Verka, like their parents, provided refugees, sometimes at great risk, with all kinds of services to help people who went abroad to continue their struggle. We sincerely thanked Pani Ludmila, the kind genius of this house, whose bright mind and intuition had more than once helped us out in times of need. František, a clever man and a great cunning man, had done his dangerous work splendidly. His own safety was the last thing on his mind. "They can't get to me," he liked to say. Unfortunately, he was wrong then. "Well, let's have a drink," František suggested with a slight chuckle. We drank, and that was the last drink we had together. The 12th of January 1940 was a significant day for us. I realized that the path we were embarking on could lead me and my family anywhere, even to the underworld, but it was too late to retreat. The boy would not part with his toy car. When I tried to take the toy away from him, Milan clung to it with all his might and began to roar. The promise that the car would be safely hidden here until we returned didn't help either. What patrol for the kid? But we could not do otherwise. What patrol would believe that a modern mechanical toy belonged to the son of a woodcutter? Besides, we were afraid that with the toy in Milan's hands, it would be easier to provoke him into a professional conversation about the advantages and disadvantages of this model, and this could expose us. We were ready to leave when suddenly Milan, gloomily looking at us from head to toe, "Why are you dressed so ugly?" His voice was trembling, and the little one was ready to cry again. "We are going hunting," we replied, but I don't think he really believed it. All the way Milan was silent, only sobbing occasionally. He was obviously afraid of something, perhaps even of our sight. We were dressed in rags. Old coats and jackets hung on us like hangers. Our legs were wrapped with ropes, my face overgrown with stubble, seemed alien and frightening to him. Only he, Milan, remained Milan, a sweet boy, rosy-cheeked, with a doll's face. When he finally spoke, our whole masquerade burst like a soap bubble. The village boys didn't talk like that. Fred and I headed towards the motorway, where we were soon overtaken by Martin Vrablitz. He was travelling in a sleigh pulled by a pair of fine horses. Františka and Milan got into another sleigh near the house and travelled towards Javornik. The sledge with Milan and Františka went first, followed by Fred and me. Now we had to overcome almost the most dangerous part of the road. We had to pass through an absolutely bare plain almost next to the German customs. And if the customs officers made us go through customs inspection, checking documents and luggage, that would have been the end of it. The only salvation in this situation was to act calmly, in a word, not to hide, but, on the contrary, to draw attention to ourselves in every possible way. We travelled slowly, the bell in the harness ringing gently, giving great joy to Milan. Fred and I walked beside the sledge, falling into the deep snow, and walking so that our axes and saws, which we carried on our shoulders, could be seen from afar. The Germans did not poke their noses out of the hut, and when we passed the outpost I still looked round. Everything was quiet. Then we were embraced by a huge, dense forest. The Germans rarely came here, they were afraid of getting shot. Milan froze with delight. For the first time in his life he had seen so many trees. There was a solid wall of age-old spruces, and oaks and birches began to appear at the border. We climbed higher and higher. The exhausted horses began to snort, and when the road went steeply upwards, everyone had to jump off the sledge to ease the difficult ascent. We were tired, too. Milan started crying again. "Why did you take the bells off? They jingled so well." He kept saying the same thing. They might scare away all our foxes," I answered patiently, but my words only added fuel to here in the mountains. The ringing of bells could easily give us away, so we had to take a simple precaution. After the recent storm from the north, the trees looked like white-painted pole. The snow had covered the branches and trunks only on the leeward side. At the slightest touch, the snow crumbled silently, falling from branch to branch. We and the horses were. Fred and Milan had curiosity in their eyes. Františka looked straight ahead. All the way Fred seemed withdrawn and aloof. I did not know him well, for I had had little time for children in recent years. At last we reached the woods. The young oaks swayed in the icy wind. The birds hid from the frost. Only a desperate jay ventured to fly out of the dense thickets, but disappeared again. The sledge stopped by the stacked logs. Magota carefully took Milan off the sledge and went to look around. Suddenly some unknown guy jumped up to us, grabbed Milan and disappeared with him into the forest. There was a cry for help, either ours or the baby's. And there was silence again. Everything happened so quickly and unexpectedly that I did not even have time to be confused. The ridiculous thought of kidnapping flashed into my mind, and Františka and I rushed after the kidnapper. After 2 kilometers down a steep, almost steep slope, we drove down and found ourselves in front of Cernak's gatehouse. We were in Slovakia. 2 hot bricks, on which our Milan in the sledge warmed his feet, remained in the forest. Already after the war, in the summer of 1947, when we took a trip along the path of our wanderings and again found ourselves at a familiar copse, the bricks were lying in the same place. Then I fired a whole clip from my army pistol into the air, and we drank to our health and happiness. In the gatehouse we changed our clothes and tidied up, and then Františka's kind heart could not bear it. She began to give away our things. From the little we had that could be of use to the children, she managed to give something to the local children. "What are you doing?" I asked my wife. But we are already there, she said cheerfully. Lord, this is only the beginning, and no one knows what will happen to us tomorrow. Our mother's charity cost, Fred his boots. The boots went to Janko Cernak, Milan's kidnapper. Without shelter, that's how we became emigrants. Having slipped across the border under the enemy's nose, of course, we felt like heroes and had no thoughts of returning. We remembered those who in the past, 100 years ago, had embarked on similar wanderings in foreign lands. After lunch at the Chernuks, we headed towards Miava. Passing the farm, we went up the long hill to Poliana. Milan was walking beside me, holding me tightly by the hand and entertaining us with endless conversations. Suddenly, as if from under the ground, a Slovak gendarme patrol appeared in front of us. We could not avoid this encounter. I whispered to the children that during the snowball game, which we immediately started, they should laugh but never say a word. The gendarmes were already close by. I spoke quickly in Slovak. They stopped, watched our inappropriately merry game for a while, then went on their way. Everything turned out safely this time too. On the right above us towered Sharp Hill, which during the big manoeuvres in 1935 had caused me and my colleagues a lot of trouble. A little further away were the ruins of the castle of Chetice. The Miava River flowed below, and behind us we left our unhappy homeland groaning under the boots of the invaders. At Polana, at the watershed of the Morava and the Danube, we stopped. I looked with inexpressible excitement at the haze-covered Moravian hills, which in the rays of the setting sun seemed like gigantic theatre sets. In the light of the fading day, the landscape took on a softer and more delicate shape. All this was heartbreaking, and the separation from the homeland became unbearable. Closely pressed against each other, we stood on the deserted motorway, gripped by sadness and fear of what was to come. The January sun was saying goodbye to us, and we were saying goodbye to Moravia, to our father and relatives, to Prague, to everything that was dear to us. We took nothing with us on the long journey except our own lives and our children, our only wealth. In the rapidly thickening darkness, we set off on a long journey, full of uncertainty and doubt. On the calendar was 12 January 1940. The descent to Miava turned out to be easier than we expected. Not far from Mijava, we were overtaken by Miroslav Kriz, who had been sent by the Chernakis. He drove us to Zuti. With great difficulty, we all squeezed into the low hut of Zut. There was a workshop directly adjacent to the hut. Mijava was literally swarming with spies, but Jans Rutter and Alsbieta, his wife, cordially welcomed us, as they did many other emigrants who always found a safe haven in their house. The news was not encouraging. The Gestapo on the Hungarian border had blocked all the railways leading to Budapest. This not only complicated matters, but could also lead to disaster. Something had to be done immediately. Together with my escort, I went to the priest's house. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the instinct of self-preservation, or perhaps remembering the traditions of my family, where religion and religious morality were highly honoured in the past. In short, I found myself in the house of a priest. The owner himself came a little later. Behind tightly closed shutters, we discussed the situation with Chaplain Valak, priest Sibylka, and other trusted people. They all unanimously advised me to go to Puszty Fedaims and cross the Hungarian border there. Sibylka recommended to stop on the way in Brezov near Bradl at the local priest, who would give me some news. It was agreed that at 9 o'clock in the evening a taxi driver, Chernak, would be waiting for us at the junction of the motorway south of Mijava. I returned home in high spirits. The plan of action I had planned had to be implemented as soon as possible. I crept into the bedroom. Everyone was asleep. I leaned over to my wife and whispered softly, "We must leave now." She didn't immediately understand me. Smiling, taking my words as a joke, "I hope you don't mean it." "In an hour we have to be out of town," I said firmly. Frantiska wanted to lie in bed. Then I took on the boys. But of course they found support from their mother. "Come on, gang, get up." I shouted almost fiercely. "We're leaving in half an hour." The children, however, hid themselves under the blanket again. I pulled it down and they pulled it towards them. "Tell me, do you have a heart?" Frantiska couldn't stand it. "That's exactly what I have." "Ma'am, can't you see that they've just warmed up and they're sleepy?" "They'll sleep well tomorrow." It wasn't true. God only knew where we'd be tomorrow. "You're a barbarian. Do you really want to send them out into the street on a night like this and in this cold?" "Yes, on such a night and in such a cold." I echoed. You are a cruel man. Františka sighed resigned and began to dress. Half an hour later we were at the crossroads. On the back of Anna Panik Bohorikova, the Zrut's maid, hung a small rucksack with food and hot drink for us. It was so dark that we could not see the car that was a metre away from us. And together with the chaplain, we left for Brzezova near Bradl. On the way I pondered our route, go to Hungary via Zvolen and Lusenek, where I had once served, or via Rimavska Brzezova, where it was said to be easier to cross the border, but where I knew no one. Both options were equally risky, but, as they say, better a tit in hand than a crane in the sky. It was hardly worth wasting time and energy if the priest himself strongly advised me to go through Brzezova. After all, he had information, though not confirmed, that it was easier to cross the border at Pustafedimes. Besides, in Brzezova, the priest said, there were people who would help with transport and everything else, not because of money, but for the sake of human solidarity. The priest's last words sounded too high-minded, but it was still worth a try. At home, in Prague, preparing to leave, I thought more than once that this trip with my family was like a heavy cavalry march. It could be successful only if we could make the whole long journey from Belka to Yugoslavia in one fell swoop. As it turned out later, that night in Mijava was our salvation. 2 weeks after we arrived in Belgrade, none of the refugees could get here. The Tolonchaz in Budapest was overcrowded. The snow-covered roads had become impassable. Disaster would have befallen us, too, if I had been less determined and firm that night of 12 January. And so we stood in front of the priest's house in Brezov near Bradl. I looked for the doorbell, and at that moment I was pierced by a previously unknown feeling, the feeling of uncertainty in front of a closed door. I might not have been let in. I might have been chased off the threshold, or the dogs might have been set loose. Anything was possible. I hesitated to ring the bell for a long time, then I touched it, but I didn't have the guts to press the button. Here, at the door of a stranger's house, I suddenly felt like a beggar. I could clearly imagine how a beggar rings the doorbell, how he feels when it is opened, and how he leaves after standing in vain at the closed door. It was all similar. We were beggars. Our possessions were a small bundle of unpretentious clothes. Outcasts, vagabonds with no shelter and no future, we stood at a strange, firmly locked door. Our children stood beside us. I couldn't press the bell. The chaplain did it for me. The door was opened by a gentleman who was no longer young, with a friendly face and kind eyes. He invited us into the house. At the door of the living room I stopped like a stumbling block. The spacious, cosily furnished room was warm. The priest's wife was knitting in an armchair. A large black cat purred at her feet. A clock ticked slightly. The priest's daughter was reading a book. A large table in the centre of the room was lit by a dim lamp. A soft semi-darkness lurked in the corners of the living room. Everything radiated peace, peace, silence. And this is what I stole from my children. Robbing them of their home, my mind raced, and a familiar ache squeezed my heart. Through the eyes of my children, I looked enviously round the room we were in. The priest's wife asked us in a sympathetic manner if we were hungry. No, thank you. We ate. I answered hastily for all of us. Just not enough. Milan's voice sounded resentful. The time was nearing 10 o'clock in the evening. It was Jan Lichner gave us good news. It was possible to cross the border at Pustafedimes, but we had to take some Pengioi moonshine with us. If we decided to set off at once, the taxi driver Kopecki would come here right away. I agreed. The taxi driver arrived, exchanged our Czechoslovak money for Slovak and Hungarian money, and even took care of a suitcase for us. He was right. Things should have been packed well. We could not leave at once. We had to wait for 2 more people, who were also helped by the priest and who were to go with us. It is about 11 o'clock in the evening we finally set off. It was bitterly cold outside. The mercury was 31 degrees below zero. My feet were unbearably cold in the car. Milan slept on his mother's lap. Fred shrank from the cold in the back seat. Exhausted, my wife and I barely spoke a word. It was a little over 80 kilometres to Pustafedimes through Arbov and Trnava, and this in a wind-blown old truck. Our companions were not eager to engage in conversation. They were always whispering about something, which made me dislike them. Sometimes I heard separate words, fragments of phrases. I think they were talking about Budapest, because they often repeated the name of a famous Budapest hotel. We were approaching some settlement. To keep quiet, I asked the driver where we were. It's Voderady, he replied. Voderady. My wife looked at me in surprise. The beams of the headlights caught the corner of a house on a bend, and all was dark again. It was an amazing coincidence. We were in the place where Frantiska had been born, and where I had never been able to go in the 16 years of our life together. Here is Pusti Fedimesh. In the pitch darkness, someone led us into an empty room, where there was nothing else but a table with a bottle on it and a narrow bench. It was close to midnight. Small in stature, stubby, with a gloomy look, speaking sharply and imperiously. Another younger man came in, and though at first sight he too might have seemed withdrawn and unsociable, his face gave me confidence. I don't remember exactly how their quarrel with Frantiska began. At first they frowned at it, but then they couldn't stand it. The younger man started pushing Frantiska's maternal feelings. "And don't you feel sorry for the children you've made homeless?" he began. "What kind of mother are you? How can you watch them suffer?" said the other one sharply. There seemed to be no end to the recriminations. We kept silent. Finally Frantiska asked, "Do you have children?" "A daughter," replied the young man, "and I preferred to leave her at home with my wife. It remains to be seen which of us did better with the children. You by leaving your daughter at home, or we by taking them with us?" Frantiska said sadly. A year had passed. A terrible year. We had Christmas again. The first Christmas in England, I remember my wife received a letter from a Czechoslovak unit stationed somewhere in England. Our acquaintance from Pusti Fedimes apologized for the harshness with which he had spoken to Frantiska a year ago and wrote bitterly, "I would give a lot today for my family to be near me." Then a young boy came and said that he would lead us across the border. Should we trust a boy? We were expecting an experienced man, but we saw a 15-year-old teenager. First impressions can be deceiving. Keep a certain distance from each other, but don't let me out of your sight. If I fall, you fall. If you are discovered, run towards the ploughed field and lie quietly there, he instructed us. Well, the kid sounded pretty confident. I put Milan on my shoulders, and we set off. At first I went ahead, and then I joined the tail of the column. If the lead group came across Slovak or Hungarian border guards, Milan and I had to have at least some time to get away. We told Milan that we were going hunting, and to avoid scaring away all the animals around, we had to keep quiet. The two grumblers walked along with us. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. The frosty air burned my face. The snow crunched under my feet. Somewhere dogs barked. We lay on the ground and seemed to wait forever for the signal to move on. The silence of the night was ringing in our ears. We hid in haystacks and bushes, crawled over ravines. There seemed to be no end to it. One particularly deep, steep-walled ravine could only be crossed by climbing down with Milan at my side. The child screamed loudly. In the silence of the borderland, that scream echoed far around. I froze. I thought I heard the sound of people running towards us, but fortunately it was only a play of imagination. What had happened? The explanation was simple. On the way down, the thorny branches of the shrubbery caught on Milan's hat and started pulling it off his head. Of course, the little boy was frightened, thinking that someone unknown was trying to pull him off his father's back. I wasn't angry with Milan. This unfortunate ravine was the new Hungarian border. At a signal, we stopped and lay down on the ground again. Our guide went to the Hungarian border guards to discuss the terms of the crossing. They demanded more money and moonshine, he said when he returned. We gave money and moonshine. A little later, a Hungarian soldier came for us. Frantiska alone knew Hungarian, and this saved us in the night meeting at Sieged. She spoke quietly in Hungarian, and I saw the soldier point to some dark door. I was frightened at first, but it was an ordinary stable, a small domestic stable with a blinded window. There was a cow lying on the straw. The stable was next to a railway junction, which the Hungarian authorities had made into a station in 1939, where fast trains also stopped. That warmth and that smell. We settled down on the fragrant hay and put ourselves in the hands of fate. All we had to do was wait. Waiting for the train to arrive, waiting for our hour, and finally waiting for whatever would happen next. It was quiet. The cow took a few deep breaths, chewed lazily. The straw crunched under her feet. Something rustled in the corner. Everything that had happened in these last hours flashed before my eyes. I've got great boys, I thought proudly. They've held up splendidly. It is no nonsense. In 30-degree frost, deep in the night to walk more than a dozen kilometres, to crawl across a frozen field, to lie in the snow for a long time, to wade through a thorny bush, and all this without crying or complaining. Someone sharply tore open the stable door. An unfamiliar man appeared on the threshold. The light of the lamp travelled across the sleeping figures and stopped on Frantiska, who held Milan in her arms. The man muttered something resembling an aha. It could have been surprise, or it could have meant got you, little birds. The door slammed shut, and it was dark again. No one said a word. Everyone was waiting for something. The minute the man lit the stable with the lamp, I didn't see Fred. Then I found him. Buried deep in the hay, he was sound asleep. A few minutes later the door opened again, and the same man, greeting us from the threshold, pushed 2 more into the stable. There were 8 of us. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I'm a local Fedimesh priest," and disappeared again. Later we met him once in England. Mihalitz, the army priest, told us how he had almost been captured by the Germans during a night crossing, and how he had to flee across the border. Without belongings, without money. In this our fates were similar. At about 6:30, the fast train Bratislava-Budapest was due. We came out of the stable. The frost was burning our faces. We jumped and raced, trying to get warm somehow. To amuse the children, I suggested we play Indians. Like an expert tracker, I put my ear to the rail to hear if a train was coming, but my ear immediately froze to the cold metal. I had to peel it off with my skin. Finally, the lights of the train showed in the distance. We got into the carriage and moved towards Budapest, towards the unknown. Thus, on our way to freedom, we crossed the border of one more country. There was a third one left, the Yugoslavian border. In knowledgeable Prague circles, they said that crossing the Yugoslav border was like taking a walk. Well, let's see. Stalemate. In a well-heated carriage, we travelled along the bend of the Danube, through Nove Zamki and Parkany, south to Budapest. We were on the territory of that part of Slovakia which had been annexed by Hungary and where the military bureaucratic plutocracy, represents terrible variety, the fascist pseudo-intelligentsia, reigned supreme. Here it was risky to arouse the slightest suspicion about our origin. I had heard in Prague that in Hungarian territory they took off trains and caught at railway stations all those who did not know the language and who seemed suspicious. Luckily, my wife was fluent in Hungarian, but I didn't know a word. In order to somehow protect ourselves, we decided to proceed as follows. Whenever something needed to be said, Frantiska would start speaking in Hungarian, and I would support the conversation by inserting a yes or no in Hungarian at her sign. It was all I was capable of. The best thing to do, of course, was to keep quiet and pretend to be asleep. That's what we did. But another danger awaited us, against which we were powerless. Warm in the warm carriage, Milan was about to fall asleep. His head was leaning sideways, his eyes were closed, but before he fell asleep I whispered in his ear, "When you wake up in the morning, there will be some very bad, evil people around us. If you talk, they will take me and Mummy away and you will be alone. Don't talk about—" Milan mumbled sleepily in a sleepy voice, "I won't talk." I didn't really believe that my words had reached his mind, and that he wouldn't surprise us in the morning, so I kept repeating, "Don't talk about anything." At last sleep overcame the little one. Suddenly a Hungarian guide approached us. He asked us where we were from, if our child was ill, and where we were going. By some miracle, Frantiska managed to distract the intrusive guide from such a dangerous conversation. Apparently satisfied with what Frantiska had told him, he stood up and walked away. I pretended to be asleep. It was safer that way. Through half-closed eyelids I could see that the guide was still watching us. Maybe he was alerted by the too correct Hungarian my wife spoke. At dawn, when we, tired of fighting drowsiness, began to fall asleep, 2 Hungarian gendarmes with helmets decorated with plumes of cock's feathers entered the carriage. God works in mysterious ways. They sat down on the bench opposite us. I squeezed my eyes shut in fear. But they did not question us. I were not interested in us. That was a good sign. It meant that we didn't arouse any suspicion. Brave castles in Hungary. It was very sad to see how our republic had been trimmed down. Settling down in a corner of the compartment, I indulged in memories. The dramatic days of Munich came to life again. The elapsed 15 months. could not drown out the feeling of utter hopelessness in the face of the terrible catastrophe we had experienced then. Then came the epiphany. With the steady pounding of the wheels, my memories of that time became clearer and clearer. Then, in 38th, I was a major teaching artillery tactics at the military school in Prague. I had been recalled to the school from the North Sea border zone, where we were enthusiastically building our Maginot Line. The French would gladly swap it for their own. I remember well what a strenuous and exciting job it was. But what satisfaction we felt when we managed to create another defence line on Czech soil. I dreamed of being there when the fortifications you had built would show their strength in practice and our work would be appreciated. I didn't like to abandon what I had started halfway through, but what were our efforts in the north worth if the southern borders with Austria remained unfortified? Instinctively, we felt that the enemy was in our rear, and we wondered why our government was doing nothing, why our southern borders were open wide. This criminal inaction could not be explained. Now I understand how we wiped Hitler's nose by carrying out partial mobilization in May. Nothing had yet come out of the threat of immediate aggression. The Fuhrer was running rampant. It is quite understandable that my studies at the military school ended early, and I was sent to the operational department of the military commissariat in Bratislava. When general mobilization was announced on 23 September 1938, I went with secret documents to Banska Bystrica. In Trenčín, I went to the post office and sent a letter of testament to my family. War is inevitable, I said to myself. On the way back, starting from Trnava, I persistently sought with my gaze the black clouds of fire over Bratislava. I was sure that the city had been bombed by the enemy. Yes, I almost wished for it. I justified my barbaric desires by the fact that there was no other way but to fight the enemy. Better an open battle. Looking at the faces of the people on the road, I looked for signs of oppression, excitement, or determination, but they were calm. Their behavior did not correspond to my desires. This irritated me. In Pessinok, I already knew for sure that we had lost the war without a fight, but we had lost the peace too. A clear, cloudless sky stretched over Bratislava. How I wish I could forget those days before the surrender. While reminiscing, I almost overlooked the Ostrogomsk Cathedral on the Danube, floating majestically outside the carriage window. The cathedral reminded me of Parkani on the other side of the river, and also of the painful reality that we would soon be leaving Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, how unanimously the whole nation went to mobilization. People called up from the reserves came to the mobilization stations, usually before the specified time, in such numbers that it created unforeseen difficulties. It was all unexpected and overwhelming. To save time, wives said goodbye to their husbands at their workplaces. Columns of men stretched through the night Bratislava. Women walked alongside. Everything was done with a kind of feverish haste. The mobilization had been done in 3 days instead of the supposed 8. I thought about it with pain and pride, although, to tell the truth, I should have thought about what awaited us in 2 days. I heard the tragic surrender announcement on the radio at the 3rd Army headquarters in Kremnica. It was a thunderclap. After the initial shock, we vented our anger against the government. The senior officers only made critical remarks, but we, the youth, rioted. We rebelled. I will never forget those exciting moments. We wanted to do something immediately, but we did not know where to start. We tried to find among the generals a strong, popular man capable of leading the army, but no star appeared on our horizon. And then we chose General Polala. After the surrender, he asked us if we were ready to go with him to the end. Yes, we were ready, we replied with one voice. He, however, was not ready. That is exactly what became clear during the mobilization. To give up our positions in the name of peace. In this we did not understand at all. We believed that an effective army should defend the Republic. We thought that we should fight for freedom to the end. Why didn't it happen? Even if the general situation could justify immediate surrender, it was still impossible to sit idly by. We had to fight. The national pride of the people called for it. The aspiration of many generations for freedom, and this was incompatible with Hitler's dictatorship, I told myself. It was worth fighting for, and the struggle became the meaning of my life. We were moving south along the left bank of the Danube. The river seemed to be frozen solid. The white, tediously monotonous surface of the ice brought me back from the world of memories. But before I could finally part with the past, for some reason I suddenly remembered my friends. There were children sleeping next to me. Why were they deprived of their homes and sent to a foreign land? Why were thousands upon thousands of civilians expelled from their native land? May, the biggest political swindle of the time, turned out to be a tragedy not only for the Czech people. It shattered the international prestige of those Western powers that condoned it. It is difficult to go into mortal combat with a stone around our necks, but still we did not have to capitulate. We were moving towards Budapest. As we approached the capital, the carriage filled with people. Milan was asleep. When he woke up, he sat up, looked at me and others with wide-open eyes, and then it seemed to me that he remembered the words I had whispered in his ear before he fell asleep. I was unarmed. I could not forbid him to speak now. But Milan was silent. He did not utter a word. He turned sharply away and stared stubbornly out of the window all the way. At the railway station, we got off the train, bought some Hungarian newspapers, and quickly blending in with the crowd, went to the square. We walked wherever we looked. Milan continued to be silent. He was so diligently silent that at last I could not bear it and, smiling, said to him, "There are good people around us now, and you can speak freely." So we arrived in Budapest, without papers, illegally, with children who were not a step behind us. Where to next? I knew, Rue Feu, house number 17, the French consulate, to say Buni. It was the password I'd been given in prayer. Rue Felks. You have to cross to the other side of the river and take the first street to the right along the embankment, the woman I met explained. The Danube was cold. Right in front of us stood the impregnable fisherman's tower, which crowned the fortress walls. Just beyond the bridge, the long faux street began. Budapest was awakening. The pious, smartly dressed citizens were hurrying to the morning mass, and we, poorly groomed, in ragged clothes, hungry and thirsty, were walking up the street. A bearded old man was sitting by a dilapidated building at No. 17 reading newspapers. The sign on No. 18 on the opposite side of the street confirmed that this was the consulate of the French Republic. So they didn't want to do anything on the consulate grounds and had decided to use No. 17 for that purpose? What about the password? Where to find the mythical Mr. Buni? Or maybe it's not a name at all? I went round the whole house from bottom to top, rang all the doors. Nobody knew anything. When the tenant on the top floor said to me, "I don't know of such a person," all my hopes were dashed. For a moment I thought the bearded man was following me. But I was wrong. I was overcome with confusion, which I tried to hide from my wife. What to do about the family? I had to put her somewhere. We walked up the street again, and then I saw a cafe. There were officers sitting at tables. It was an officers' cafe. I think mine would be safe here. I left my family in the cafe and went on alone. It was easier now. To ensure our safety, it was still necessary to get to the consulate today. There was a gendarme on duty at the entrance to the consulate, 20 paces to the right down the street, 20 paces back. When I had the chance, I prepared to rush to the door, when I saw from afar a strange round knob at the entrance. Maybe the door was locked. If you break in, the gendarme will hear you and arrest you for attempting to enter the territory of a foreign representation. Then it's over. Good thing I stopped in time. Discreetly, I continued to look around the house. Was there no other way to get into it? There seemed to be no such possibility. The gendarme continued to retrace his steps and was always on the lookout. Disheartened, I returned to the cafe. Frantiska smiled at me, she could afford it, as she was unaware of my worries. Everything will be all right. I reassured her, though in truth there was little good in it. It was out of the question to leave the cafe, but it was risky to stay. We might be noticed. Where to go? There was nowhere to ask for help. Overwhelmed by excitement, I headed once again towards the French consulate. There, in the language of the newspapers, the situation continued unchanged. But time for Františka, sitting in the cafe, it stretched too slowly. I stood idly by when something had to be done. But what? My wife was beginning to worry too. When I returned, I noticed that she was looking at me with a troubled, inquisitive look. What that look meant, I was already well aware of. I wonder where those two from Brezova are. In Ferimas they got on the train with us, but in Budapest they disappeared. I can't say I missed them, but in this situation it's good to stick together. Listen, I asked my wife, do you remember what those two in the car were saying about Budapest? She couldn't remember anything. Maybe you can remember some name they kept repeating. She couldn't remember. Then Františka took out the phone book and started reading the names of the hotels, and I listened to how they sounded. Wait, maybe the Metropole. I said, Metropole. Yes, Metropole. I dashed to the hotel on the other side of the Danube. It was a real marathon. They were sitting in the lobby by the palm tree. I was ready to hug them with joy, but they didn't even react to my appearance. Are you waiting? I asked, pretending to know everything. We are. He's not here yet. Not yet, they said dryly. I'm waiting for him too, I said. We sat and waited, and we were silent. Time passed, another hour, but no one appeared. I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to know if something had happened to my family. On the way back, my imagination painted the most terrible pictures. But, thank God, everything turned out to be all right. No one touched them, only the waiter was asking Frantiska something. Her eyes were still full of anxiety. Strange thing. There, in the Metropole, I had only thought about the safety of my wife and children, but after making sure that they were safe and sound, I found myself mentally back in the hotel, next to those two Czechoslovakians, and now I was most afraid of losing contact with them. On no account must we lose touch with these mysterious strangers, I thought, and rushed again to the Metropole. There they sat, grim, unapproachable. The rush between the hotel and the cafe had finally roused my nerves, and I made up my mind. Before leaving the hotel again, I asked the two men to leave a note for me in the palm tree, telling me how to get to the consulate. I'm missing today, tomorrow it will be too late. I shouted in desperation. The fact that we didn't have any documents made us wary all the time. For the fourth time, I crossed the endlessly long bridge. Instinctively sensing danger, Frantiska did not hide her anxiety, although I tried to look good. Milan alone, that happy child, paid no attention to anyone and drew his own soldiers. The third time I went to the hotel with Fred, I didn't know why I did it. Maybe intuition? Just as we crossed the bridge, we saw a Hungarian policeman slowly heading in our direction. 1, 2, 1, 2. I immediately understood everything. We had attracted attention. Now he would want to see our passports. The moment was critical. I said to my son in a low voice, and I swore at him in the coarse German slang I had heard from the Germans during the construction of the border fortifications. The policeman was confused, then smiled understandingly, stood for a while, listened, and W1, 2, we went back to his post. I felt as if my son had thrown me a lifeline. If I had been walking alone, the policeman would have asked me to show my papers, because I could not swear in German with myself. Another surprise awaited me. To my great horror, the two men had disappeared from the Metropole. It was as if they had vanished. I began frantically searching the palm tree. There was no, it's impossible. I reassured myself. Had they thought what would happen to us tonight if I hadn't made contact with the consulate by then? After all, I have asked them for help, and they have promised it to me. They know the situation I'm in. I was horrified. When Fred and I returned to the cafe, my wife immediately realized that we were in a bad way. Suddenly, as often happens in life, the acute nervous tension brought back something I had forgotten. I suddenly remembered Mr. Stein. Yes, Mr. Stein, one of the directors of the Vitkovis Iron and Steel Works. My brother-in-law had once said that I could always turn to him in case of need. My wife's face lit up with hope. But where to find this Stein? I had not thought of him before, probably because my head was full of other thoughts and worries, and the time was passing. I asked my wife, "Mind the telephone numbers of the biggest hotels in the directory." She started calling them. "Yes, he lives here." The Gellert Hotel replied kindly, and a few seconds later we heard Mr. Stein's voice. How could I not remember Carol? "Please come in," he cordially invited us in. Saved, with a heavy sigh. Frantiska and I sank into our armchairs. The crazy day seemed... Stein was staying in a comfortable room at the Hotel Gellert in the centre of the city, on the right bank of the Danube. On this Sunday afternoon, aristocratic Budapest looked solemn. As we made our way through the foyer to the lift, I could feel the stares of this crowd at us ragamuffins. Timidly, we crossed the threshold of Stein's apartment. Through the half-open bedroom door, we could see a huge bed that could accommodate several people at once. Stein must have taken care of everything in advance. I looked up into his face. He was talking about the Vitkovitsky Iron and Steel Works, recalling the history of the plant, its problems. Not a word about politics. Watching us carefully, he asked with interest if he could be of any help to us. "Would you allow us to spend the night at your place?" I asked, and suddenly I felt an unbearable longing. Stein was petrified, but then, pulling himself together, he asked, "Do you have papers?" It was already clear to me. "Mr. Stein and not a naval. One does not run across the border with a passport," I said, and was silent. "I have officially emigrated, and I must obey the laws of this country." After Stein's words, knowing his capabilities, I was still hoping for something, but he finished firmly and decisively. "So that's out of the question. But we have nowhere to go." He shrugged indifferently. I should have got up and left, of course, but I didn't. I waited silently for what would happen next. In my mind, I cursed his cowardice. Contempt for this man grew in me, and they will destroy us. The silence that followed lasted for what seemed like an eternity. It's not something you forget. There was nothing more for us to do here at Stein's. We stood there looking into each other's eyes. I was nervous, and he couldn't help but feel it. My mind was in chaos, and my confidence was leaving me. But I controlled myself, and when Stein was about to explain why he could not do otherwise, I said in a strange voice, "Leave them for 2 hours at least." What those 2 hours could change, I didn't know. Why 2 hours? I involuntarily thought of how blissful he had been here, in this room, while we, like stray dogs, were wandering on the roads. I asked for 2 hours, and I got them. For a minute he looked at me with bewilderment and concern. Maybe it was in that minute that he realized what it really meant to be an emigrant, to be in hiding all the time with no documents and no money. Maybe at that moment he was afraid of me. Yes, such a thought could be frightening. And from the constant nervous tension, my senses were dulled, and I did not feel any pity for this man now. I was afraid that he would read my thoughts, but I was afraid of them myself, for they gave me back my lost courage. 2 hours. Only 2 hours. In 2 hours we would have to leave this room and look for something again. I knew we had to leave, but I did not know where to go. Where was the shortest way to the Yugoslav border? I didn't even have a map, and I didn't want to risk asking people. Any questioning would arouse suspicion. Minute after minute passed. At last I got up to go. Under the bridge, I scrutinized the part of the embankment adjacent to it, hoping to find some place to sleep. A cold wind was blowing. The vaults of the bridge were perfectly smooth and did not hide from view. I could see nothing in the neighbouring courtyards. They were all locked. I sank down on the steps. Hopelessness and despair seized me. What would happen to us in 2 hours? Confusion and fear made me reckless. The cold from the river, the cold chilled my heart from the thoughts that swarmed in my head. To surrender to the authorities, which meant immediate reprisals, or, against my host's will, to sleep in his room for a night, and in the morning to move towards the Yugoslavian border. I was ready to cry, but every minute I was more and more inclined to the fatal decision. It seemed to be the only, the most correct and the easiest way to salvation. Fear and doubts were gone. The only thing left was to spend the night in Gelert and in the morning to flee to Sieged. Something was still stopping me, but I saw no other way out. When I had already decided to spend the night at Stein's, a lightning thought struck me to the point. "Mr. Booney," I answered the porter who asked me who I was looking for. "Number 216, please," said the porter. I shuddered at the thought that if I hadn't been here at the Metropole, we would have been finished. I stared at the pour. How simple it was. A second later, I was standing in front of room 216. I knocked. The door was ajar, and I quickly slipped my foot through the crack. I shouldn't have done that, of course. Someone was forcibly trying to close it from the other side. There was a silent struggle. And then it hit me. "Booney," I whispered into the gap. The door swung open. A strange man stood before me, and behind him were the 2 Czechoslovakians with whom we had travelled here from Brizova. When they saw me, they were embarrassed. But now I was already on horseback. Mr. Booney, it was him, of course, had covered the door so carefully behind me, as if he wanted to hide from the world. He did not utter a word. He seemed clearly shocked by my uninvited intrusion. All 3 of us were already dressed and about to go downstairs to the car to go to the French consulate. My God, what would have become of us if I had been just a minute late? A moment, a blink of an eye separated us from total collapse. No, what can I say? There are miracles in the world. In the car, I was quietly blissful and silent. What happiness! Looking from the sidelines at my compatriots, I reflected on human cruelty. Within the consulate grounds, we were safe at last. Mr. Stein could now sleep in peace. After the necessary formalities, I rushed to the taxi to pick up my family. Thank you for letting them stay. It was very kind of you. Thank you, I said to Stein. He could sense the irony in my voice. Where are you staying? Hungary. Mr. Stein, I'm sure you and I would remember this night for the rest of our lives. Stein looked at me in surprise. Do you want money? He offered. Yes, I could use it, I answered with a sudden arrogance, and glanced at his handsome face, which was slightly perplexed. I had not a penny in my pocket. You'll need it, he concluded, and I took the money. It did not linger in my pocket. They had a short fate. We drove through the unfamiliar neighbourhoods of the city. The car meandered through the streets for a long time, until finally it stopped in front of an old one-story house. I held the children's hands the whole way. I felt as if we were being chased by gendarmes. Without looking round, we ran into the entrance. We were led into a cellar of some kind. It looked like a den, and the only thing that reminded us of the presence of people here was the garden furniture piled in the corner. Round tables, folding chairs. A winter storehouse of summer furniture. I searched in vain for a single window. There was no water, no food. There was only darkness and cold. And yet in this den we felt good. To realize this, it was enough to remember the events of the previous day. Here, in the cellar, nothing threatened us, and the terrible fatigue was replaced by a good mood. The boys were having fun, and I had to work hard to keep them quiet. Having made up the tables, we lay down on them and soon, happy, fell asleep. It was a strange night, the strangest I can remember. I made a vow then that I would never again allow myself to lose control of myself as I did on that ill-fated Sunday. When I woke up the next morning to 2 round tables, I didn't immediately realize where I was. It was the Deerfee guest house on Hamid Sadiq Street. I emerged from the cellar, smiled at the sun and the earth, and was overcome with a joyous feeling. We were alive. Impact. We left around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The mood was good, the weather favourable. The 6-seater Pugayote was packed to capacity. Along with us rode 2 young Czechoslovakian pilots who were in a hurry to France. The route Budapest-Szeged. Horgos was well enough mastered. We drove along the Tisa along a typical Magyar plain, starting from Kecski, mitrally studded with numerous lakes. The enchanting sounds of Hungarian Rhapsody came to mind, while outside the window we saw pictures of Liszt's music come to life. Snow-covered villages, wells with cranes, flocks of sheep. Snow covered the whole endless valley. The children had a good night's sleep. Fred was a model of calmness and obedience. Frantiska looked a little tired, but everyone was in high spirits. We knew what we were excited about, and during the night we would cross the 3rd and final border, which was said to be open to free movement. This seemed so improbable that all sorts of doubts swarmed in me, but I immediately drove them away. Soon we would be greeted by a free country. Freedom, we learnt its true price when the Nazis came to our land. As dusk began to fall, we drove quietly into Szeged with the lights off. The car stopped near a low house on a side street. In the semi-basement flat to which we were led, we waited for a while for the guide. Here we heard that 2 more cars with live cargo were expected from Budapest. The guide, who spoke Hungarian with a marked accent, demanded too high a fee for his services, arguing that our case was very risky and that he would not, after all, guarantee the safety of his wife and children. Frantiska suddenly intervened in the conversation. She assured the guide in Hungarian that everything would be all right. After that, the guide spoke only to Frantiska, and she translated for me. The guide gave simple instructions. When I leave you alone, he said, you will already be on the territory of Yugoslavia, not far from the lake. On the left you will see the lights of the Horgos border station. Beyond the lake you must turn left, but never right. It's dangerous. All his explanations seemed vague to me. It was already dark when we drove away from Szeged, trying not to attract attention. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening. After half an hour, the car stopped on the motorway. We got out and followed the guide to some field. The passengers of 2 other cars were walking with us. The guide was walking fast, and behind him there was a long line of people. Next to the guide was Frantiska, then me with Milan behind me, then Fred and the others. The dark night and the deep snow provided safe shelter. There were 19 of us. Our guide was almost running, apparently wanting to get rid of us as soon as possible. The pace was incredible. It became so dark that we could hardly distinguish the road. It was now a matter of life or death to keep up with the guide, who was getting faster and faster, and the distance between us was increasing. I was falling behind. Drops of sweat dripped down my eyes, and I wiped them with my handkerchief, trying not to let Milan notice. "Daddy, you're tired. Take me down to the ground," he whispered in my ear. "No, Milenik, I'm not tired. You can't stop. I can see you're sweating. I'll walk." Despite the pain, he had rubbed his leg. Milan insisted. When he came down to the ground to wipe my face, I hugged him. Those moments gave me strength. Frantiska and the guide waited for us. Then the guide slipped past me and disappeared into the night. We were left alone. Huddled together, people looked at each other. Pilots, there were only pilots around. The two from Metropolis were standing next to us. I was furious, but I kept my mouth shut. Before he disappeared, the guide said we were already in Yugoslavia. But where is Korgosh? Not a light around. Black bottomless night surrounded us. Where is the lake he was talking about? I picked at the snow with my foot. There was no ice beneath us. According to the guide, we should have gone left, but we were spinning in one place, not knowing the right direction. Everyone was pulling in a different direction. If we are really in Yugoslavia, I said to myself, why should we hide? We should shout, call the Yugoslav border guards. They will come and take us to the right place. But as it turned out, we were not in Yugoslavia at all, but still in Hungary. What surrounded us did not match the stories of the guide in Sieged. I realized that we had lost our bearings and were trapped. Cautiously, step by step, we moved forward. We walked until we saw a bright light. Without conspiring, we turned towards the light. The light was shining on the snow-covered plain from the window of the house. It's like a lighthouse. We reached for this light, which seemed friendly and welcoming to us. The house stood on the shore of the lake. Frantiska knocked on the door. For a long time no one answered, but when we had given up all hope, suddenly the deadbolt rattled and someone in the darkness asked us what we wanted. "How do we get to Horgos?" Frantiska asked in Hungarian. "Mush, hush. You're in Hungary." "Get out of here," the stranger hissed in fear. We could barely make out the man's silhouette. He waved his hand in the direction where Horgos must have been and slammed the door in our faces. That direction was instantly fixed in my memory. The light in the window went out. Discouraged, we crowded outside the house. Suddenly, almost nearby, voices were heard. The next thing happened instantly. Two figures emerged from the darkness. Soldiers. Our group instantly vanished, but my family and I had nowhere to go. "Stop." The soldiers shouted after the fugitives and prepared to shoot. Shocked, I waited in horror to see what would happen next. But then something unexpected happened. "Don't shoot." Frantiska shouted, and with a sharp movement, she lowered the rifle muzzle of the soldier standing next to her into the ground. This unexpected female shout stunned the soldiers. No shots were fired. For a few seconds there was a lingering pause. Frantiska looked at me fearfully, and I suddenly realized that the soldiers were drunk. My children clung to me, and we waited in fear to see how it would end. Lieutenant Casal and another pilot showed themselves to be real men. They voluntarily stayed with us, even though they could have fled. The soldiers enjoyed their power. And we, with our hands up, feeling the muzzles of our rifles against our chests, helpless and defenseless, stood before them. The drunken Hungarians, laughing and grimacing, could have killed us at any moment. When they learnt that we were on our way to Horgos, they started shouting back and pushing us with their rifles back into the darkness. Frantiska kept saying something to try to stop them, but it only made the soldiers more excited. One of them even tried to kiss us, shouting obscenities. And then Fred, our calm, sensible Fred, couldn't take it anymore. "Hit them, Dad." For God's sake, not again." I shouted. I was proud of my son, but my mind told me to stay calm. We offered the soldiers money. They took everything we had except for a 5 coin, which I had thoughtfully hidden in my shoe earlier. Once they had the money in their hands, they rushed to search us. They grabbed everything, even Fred's diary, mistaking it for banknotes. The loud fussing of drunken soldiers might have attracted attention, for we were on the frontier. Some soldiers might have been joined by others. We had to get it over with. How could I escape from their hands? I thought frantically. The soldiers were drunk. Their moods were changing, their reactions were dulled, and it was dark all around. I had a plan in my head. It might be worth a try. I shared my thoughts with Frantiska. My wife began to tell the soldiers that we were hiding from Hitler and that he would soon reach them. The Hungarians, together with the Hungarian people, we will fight the Nazis to the end. That's what Františka said, and our calculations were justified. As soon as she was silent, I took Milan in my arms and handed him to her. Quacking to the soldiers, "Goodbye," Františka and the children disappeared into the darkness. I followed them, keeping an eye on the soldiers. They stood as if they were stone statues. When we were out of their sight, we turned sharply to the side and lay down in the snow. The soldiers quickly came to their senses and started shouting something. Then we heard the stomping of feet, the creaking of snow, but soon everything became silent. We lay in the snow for a long time, afraid to move. I had my doubts. If we set out now, we might run into a patrol again. If we delayed, the result might be the same. Milan solved my doubts. He must have been cold and began to cry quietly. Everyone got up and walked. We walked wherever we could, trying to guess the direction to Kolgosh. The hardest part was wading through the vineyards. When we reached the road, we met a man in civilian clothes. When asked where this road led, he replied, "Yugoslavia." Suddenly we heard another voice, very close. "Oh, don't believe him. He's sending you back to Hungary. I'll take you." It was a tall man, a mountain man by the look of it, wearing a long tulupi and a shaggy sheep's hat. Who was to be believed? Turning to both of them, I said, "Do you see this child?" For a while we looked at each other in silence. "If anything happens to him, it will be on your conscience." The tall one calmly replied, "Don't be afraid. We got a bit of a beating from those Hungarians too." The man spoke Slovak. Ape led the way, and soon a shout came from very close by. "Stop!" It was a Yugoslav patrol. We were saved. The border guards took us to the guardhouse. The Yugoslav border post was surrounded by barbed wire. We were met by the outpost commander, Junior Sergeant Bozo Terzic, short, swarthy-faced, with a long, drooping moustache. A peasant from Sexumadija, I thought, with deep-set black eyes. He scrutinized us carefully, lingering on Milana. After a moment's silence, the junior sergeant ordered our room to be prepared, brewed black coffee, and from a small soldier's suitcase took out a lemon for Milan. The lemon was the last one he had. Then the sergeant warmed a towel over the stove, and we rubbed Milan's feet. I could not help but notice that the sergeant looked at Milan lovingly and listened to his chatter with pleasure. Outside, meanwhile, some commotion had begun. Wait. Voices were heard. Then a man was brought in whom I recognized, to my great surprise, the man from the Metropole. He looked rather bewildered. "Aha, Colonel Kuklik. You were the one in Budapest who was messing with my head? What had caused him such confusion?" It turned out that when we were detained by the Hungarian soldiers, he had been hiding behind a haystack, watching from there. He was sure that we would not escape from the clutches of the Hungarian patrol. That same night, together with other refugees, he sneaked into Yugoslavia, where he was helped by the Yugoslav border guards, just like us. That's how he ended up at the outpost. However, when Kuklik saw us through the window, he was horrified, thinking that he had misfired and that he was back in the hands of the Hungarians. The unhappy colonel wanted to flee, but was stopped. His faithful companion, the engineer Klika from Brno, was with him. We drank black coffee and reminisced about everything we had been through. My wife and children, broken by fatigue, quickly fell asleep. I too wanted to sleep. I was also dead tired, but Terzic and I talked until the morning. Even though he spoke Serbian and I spoke Czech, we still understood each other. We had too much in common. On the wall hung an old Serbian psaltery. In the morning, when we started to say goodbye, Bozo took out the psaltery, sat Milan opposite him, and played. In his hands, this simple instrument sounded tenderly, with some underlying sadness. The sergeant kissed Milan on the forehead, hung the psaltery on the wall, and went outside with the others. Wishing us a happy journey, Bojo shook Fred's hand firmly and said excitedly, "I have a son left at home." This touching farewell to Bozo Terzic was memorable for the rest of our lives. During that night, the Yugoslav border guards rounded up all the Czechoslovak refugees. On the morning of 16 January, there were 19 of us again. Accompanied by a few soldiers, we travelled to Horgoš, where the commander of the 2nd Company of Border Guards was stationed. It was a procession of tired, finally exhausted people. Men and women stood near the houses, under the roofs of which red peppers tied with wreaths ripened in winter. They looked at us with undisguised pity. Nikitich, the commander of the company of border guards, was already aware of all our affairs. When we entered his office, he took Milan on his lap and said, "You, it turns out, are a brave young man." Nikitich listened to each of us. The episode with the Hungarian soldiers made the lieutenant furious. He banged his fist on the table and jumped up. "They won't get away with it for nothing," Nikitich said gloomily. I tried to calm him down in every possible way, to warn him against unwise action. "Think of those who are coming here after us." We left for Belgrade at night through Subotica. We were accompanied by soldiers. This precaution was more of a conspiracy, for the Stojanovic government at that time was already flirting with the Germans, and the Gestapo was practically doing whatever it wanted. The Nazis were catching and sending Czech immigrants and Yugoslav citizens of Czech origin to the Reich, so the Yugoslav patriots had to be very careful. This is how we crossed the third and final border on the way to our freedom. Salvation. In the early frosty morning of 16 January 1940, we arrived at the Belgrade railway station. Tired, we wandered through the deserted streets to the Czech house, which was in a remote area of the city. There was a transit centre there. We walked very carefully. Lights were already on in the windows of the houses. Cleaners were hurrying to work. The city was slowly awakening. I spent a sleepless night. The chill was getting to my bones. Fred was silent the whole way, looking round with interest. I was glad to see that he had matured somehow during these few harsh days, becoming more serious and masculine. Milan hurt his leg, but, as before Horgosh, he resolutely refused to let me carry him on my back, saying, "I am heavy and you are tied. I am heavy and you are tired." On the way I learnt something from the guide. He told me that my family would stay in Belgrade, that women and children would not be evacuated to France, and that all the families would be accommodated in the large hall of the Bohemian house. In the morning the Czech house looked disgusting. It is difficult to put into words what a mess it was in. A veritable stable, and these were my countrymen. There were leftovers on the dirty, flooded tables, nowhere to wash the dishes, nowhere to rest. The wretched furniture was covered with a layer of dust. In short, the sight was horrible. "No, I won't leave them here," I decided to myself at once. Anywhere but here. Frantiska and I tried to restore some order and forgot all about Milan. When we did, he was nowhere to be found. I ran round all the rooms calling for him, but in vain. I was scared out of my wits. Why should something happen when everything bad seemed? Fortunately, Milan turned up. He was sitting quietly in the far corner of the room, piled with rubbish, drawing his soldiers on scraps of paper. Milan was engrossed and paid no attention to anyone. I didn't want to disturb his calm concentration, which allowed him to isolate himself from the chaos around him. A pencil and paper were enough for the little boy. Many times later, in a foreign land, Milan's passion for drawing helped him in times of need. The house manager advised us to go to the envoy David and to Cerny, the representative of the Prague Credit Bank in Belgrade. I went to the bank ashamed of my clothes, in which I had made the whole incredible journey. The envoy met me in the most cordial manner, and I was moved to tears. I was overcome with pity for myself and my family, and I could not utter a single word. I remembered Fred's tattered shoes, Milan's bloody heels. I also remembered that I had a 5 coin hidden in my shoe, our only possession. Cerny, after a short conversation with the messenger, gave me 500 dinars. Without further ado, without any receipts, 1,000 dinars, just like that. Now I could buy my children new shoes. Soon after I left Belgrade, I learned that the Gestapo had massacred Cerny, charging him with sabotage. I was truly saddened by this news. The kind people from the Czech colony and our Yugoslav friends took care of us. On the day of our arrival, Mrs. Nikolic, a Czech by birth, invited us to her house. I am so grateful to this woman. When we formed the 1st Czechoslovak Division in France, I was calm about the fate of my family. For 4 whole months, Frantiska and her children lived in the house of this woman, the wife of a lieutenant colonel of the Yugoslav army. Frantiska was not indebted to those who came to help her. When the housing issue was resolved, she immediately got involved in work. She helped in the kitchen of the Czech house, sewed and patched torn clothes for the newly arriving refugees. Hitler's invasion of Yugoslavia stopped the flow of refugees, and in May 1940 Frantiska and her children boarded the small Greek ship Patria, which was the last to leave Split for Marseille. January was drawing to a close, and with it my stay in Belgrade. Surrounded by Frantiska's touching care, I did not feel bad at all. There was a whole day left before my departure. I had not had so much fun for a long time. We laughed and frolicked with the children. Then we had a long talk with Frantiska, discussing what she should do when I left. We decided that we couldn't stay in Yugoslavia. I did not believe in the stability of the current situation in the country, nor did I believe in some of our new friends. Under no circumstances should Frantiska agree to go to one of the Adriatic islands. There was talk that people would find a safe haven there, but I didn't believe it. Catastrophe was becoming inevitable, and while there was still a chance, we had to get out of Yugoslavia. 3 hours to go before we were separated, and then it was minutes. That evening we, 45 emigrant soldiers, went to the railway station. We came out one by one so as not to arouse suspicion, with identical packages in our hands. When will I see my family again, and will I ever see them again? Then worries about transporting people distracted me from sad thoughts. Where to now? South. It was still possible to get through there. Poland was already occupied by the Nazis. Only France could still fight. That's where the soldiers of Czechoslovakia rushed, but the French were in no hurry. In May 1940, when the Nazis will fall on them and the strange war will end, they will remember about the Allies, which betrayed. They will remember about the Czechoslovakian units stationed on the territory of France. Rounding the waters of Vardar, the train took us through Greece and Dardanelles to the south, to Constantinople to the Asian continent. Hurry to France, to where the Czechoslovak units were, before fascist Italy declared war on France. Frantiska and the children managed to cross the Strait of Messina. They were already in French territorial waters. I was waiting for them in Marseilles. Standing on a hill overlooking the harbour, I gazed out to sea, hoping to see a white sail on the horizon. I naively believed that their ship would certainly appear here, at the monument to the victims of the sea, from where I had a beautiful view of Marseilles harbour. For hours I sat on the hill, never letting go of my binoculars, but that's not what happened. The small boat had long since docked, and I received a call from the consulate. With a huge bouquet of roses, I rushed to the pier, but about it, in the next chapter. So one journey ended and another began. It was a big and risky journey. I feared for the fate of my compatriots, and this increased my strength. But I also realized how strong the ties that bound us together were. I remember everything well. The tones of their voices, their conversations, the play of glances, our actions. Every moment is forever etched in my memory. I had friends. Life itself taught me to trust those with whom yes meant yes and no meant no. But I also learnt that people are people, for good and evil are intertwined in each of us in the most bizarre ways, and I sought friends among friends. I remember with fondness those who came to our aid. I remember Colonel František Mahalik, who passed away prematurely, a courageous good pilot who served in the 311th Air Squadron in England. This cheerful, beautiful man could joke even in the most difficult moments. I remember with pain my friend and teacher Karol Miner, professor at the Academy of Arts in Prague. For 15 years we were linked by our love for painting. Thanks to Miner, I saw a lot of things in the world with different eyes. He showed me the path of struggle, which my family and I followed without hesitation. The Nazi concentration camps undermined the health of my old friend, and in December 1973 Minasha died. Major František Reddy, my wise and kind mentor, also passed away prematurely. My closest underground comrade in arms, Franta Irut, a stalwart fighter against fascism, also passed away. Martin Vrabalik and Georgi Migota died very young. It was they who led us across the border into Slovakia. Jan Cernak, who carried Milan across the Slovak border, was paralyzed. I rejoice receiving occasional letters from Franta Jagos from Velka, so we are still alive. One journey ended, another began.